All right, you guys can turn to Psalm 52. Anybody realize what that means, that we're at Psalm 52? Yep, 52, that's a year. 1 year working through the Psalms. Isn't that crazy? And that's roughly a third because there's 150, so got just shy of 2 years to go. We'll get through them all. All right, Psalm 52. Now, usually I don't spend too much time looking at the introductions to some of these Psalms, but this is a significant thing to look at because it mentions a particular incident that happened with David where he was wronged by somebody else in really a life-threatening way. But yet, David is able to just relax in the Lord, even though he's been wronged. Somebody's said things against him. Somebody ratted him out in a way that put his life in danger very intentionally, and this was a very evil man. And yet David is ultimately able to just kick his feet up, lay his head back, and say, God, I know you've got this, so I don't even need to worry about it. And so what it says, if you want to look at this introduction, it says, to the choir master. Now that tells us right off the bat that it's a song. Not just a poem to be recited, but a song to be sung. It's a maskil of David when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. Now you can read about that in 1 Samuel chapters 21 and 22 if you would like. We're not going to look at that here. But basically, David was on the run from Saul, and he had to get out in a hurry because he knew that Saul was trying to kill him. So he just took off with nothing. He had no provisions with him. He left in a hurry. And he went to one of the house of Ahimelech, where one of the little, it wasn't the temple, but maybe more similar to a synagogue, maybe, where they had different places where different priests were set up. And he goes in and he says to Ahimelech, hey, what do you have on hand? I need some stuff for my guys. We're on an urgent mission. He said, I don't have anything except the bread that's for the priests, but that's, holy bread. And he said, well, give it up. We need something. And Jesus even references this incident because it wasn't technically for David. That was technically against the law, but yet it was lawful because his life was, he was in need. And so the priest gave him the bread, and he also gave him the sword of Goliath was being kept there. And David got his stuff, and he went off. He didn't say anything to Ahimelech of what was going on. He just said, we're on an urgent mission. We need stuff. He was trying to protect Ahimelech, because then if Ahimelech was questioned by Saul, he could plead ignorance, and it would have been genuine. But David noticed that Doeg was there in the house at the time before the Lord. And he comments later, he says, I knew when I saw Doeg there that it wasn't going to be good. What happened was Saul's looking for David, and Doeg ends up being with Saul. And he says, look, why don't anybody tell me what's going on with David? And Doeg said, hey, I saw David. He went to see Ahimelech, and Ahimelech gave him provisions and sent him on his way. And so Saul grabs his troops. They go to Ahimelech's house at the place called Nob, was the town. And they rounded up all of the priests that were a part of his family. I think there was about 70 of them. And he said, what's the deal? Why are you siding with David? And they said, David's your most faithful servant. He's done everything you've asked. He's led out the troops. He's, even your son-in-law. And he said, well, you're gonna be put to death. He told his servants to put the priests to death. The servants feared the Lord and wouldn't do it. They said, we're not doing that. There's no way. So he tells Doeg, you kill him. And Doeg slaughtered Ahimelech and all of his family. Very evil man, told Saul where David was, trying to get him captured and killed. No doubt, Doeg, if you read it, was one of the chief herdsmen of Saul. So he was a servant, and, we don't know what his motivation was, but this would be a good way to step up in your political status if you get David captured. A lot of things going on. So David knew there was going to be trouble, and he was right. It cost Ahimelech and his family their lives and continued to put David's life in danger. And so that's the backdrop to this. That's the incident that's going on. That's where David's at mentally and spiritually with this. And the first thing he does when he's been wronged, he goes to God in prayer and he shares it with God. He doesn't go running around telling everybody else, hey, this is what happened. His primary thrust is, let me talk with God. And so he decides to sing a song to God about this situation. Let's look at verses 1 through 4. Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? The steadfast love of God endures all the day. And right there, he's setting it off right at the beginning to say, look, I know you're boasting about what you've done and you think you've got me and you think you've got this thing, but God's love endures all day long. You're never going to overcome God's love. He says, your tongue plots destruction like a sharp razor, you worker of deceit. You love evil more than good and lying more than speaking what is right. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. David's not painting a very joyful picture of Doeg in his prayer and song to God. And that's okay. He's just telling God about this evil man and what he's done. And granted, he's couching it in terms of speaking to Doeg about who and what he is. But remember, this is a psalm that he wrote to God. He's singing this to the Lord and just telling God about the evil man that's against him. And I think when you've been wronged by somebody, when somebody's done something to wrong you, whether they've taken advantage of you, maybe they've slandered you, maybe they've done something to stir people up against you, just tell God about it. And be honest with God. He wants us to share our feelings with him. He wants us to share our thoughts with him. He wants us to be real with where we're at, what we're experiencing, what we're walking through. And he already knows our hearts, but you see these examples he's given us, that God can handle our raw emotion. Okay, he can handle that. He knows what's in us anyway. He made us as emotional beings with feelings and that we're driven by our feelings and by passions. And when we feel like we've been slighted, we feel like we've been done wrong, we should just share that with God and confide that in him and let him know what's going on. Even if it turns out we're wrong. You know, sometimes in our emotions, we don't keep our emotions in check. Sometimes they run away with it and we're led astray with our emotions. It's okay. God's got big shoulders. He can handle us venting to him, but he's the one that we should vent to. It's very appropriate to vent to God and confide in him the things that we're dealing with. But then David sang about what God is going to do to Doeg, to his enemy. He understands that he's let God know what's going on, but then he turns around from just saying, you know, how evil this guy is and what he's done. But you're not going to get away with it. Look at verses 5 through 7. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch and tear you from your tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living. The righteous shall see and fear and shall laugh at him, saying, see the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and sought refuge in his own destruction. David had great confidence in God's justice, in God being the one to take vengeance, not ourselves. He let God do it, and he understood that judgment would come. He knew that Doeg wasn't going to get away with this. Even if he does in the short term, he's not in the long term. God has an incredible sense of justice and judgment that will become. And if we've been wronged, we have to trust God to deal with it. Notice David doesn't say, but wait until I get my hands on you. He says, but God will break you down forever. We don't take vengeance into our own hands. When we've been wronged, and perhaps the more wronged we've been, the more important it is for us to relinquish that to God and let God deal with it. And we can express our heart out to God of how evil they are, but we have to say, but God, you've got to deal with them. God, I trust that your justice will be done. I trust that you will bring judgment. It's not our responsibility to defend ourselves. It never is. Never. We see Jesus do the same thing. He entrusted himself to the Father. He let the Father take care of it. He didn't respond when he was mistreated. He just let God take care of it and said vengeance is not his to take. So confide in God where you're really at with this. trust in God, develop a deep sense of trust in his justice and his judgment. But finally, David just sits back to rest in God, which is really David's custom. I mean, this is something David did a lot. David went through a lot of stuff. He had a lot of enemies, a lot of people after him for a lot of his life. But I just want to take you back to Psalm 3 very briefly, because this is one of my favorite parts in all of the Psalms, where David is just talking about how many foes are rising against him, and everybody's saying there's no salvation for you. And in verse 5 of Psalm 3, he says, I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Thousands of people all around. And he says, you know what? I trust God, and I'm going to take a nap. I just lay down and went to sleep. And I woke again because the Lord is sustaining me. It's not that I have this strength in myself. It's not that I'm so confident I can figure this out. But he said, the Lord sustains me. I know God has this. And this seems to be a recurring thing we see in David and his Psalms is, I'm just going to kick back and relax and trust God to do this. Look at how he words it here in the final two verses of Psalm 52. He said, but I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. Now just stop right there. Get a mental picture of that. Imagine a green olive tree in the house of God, in the temple. And, I think in David's settings, it would have been, the tabernacle and a big tent where God's presence was, where the altar was. Now there's just this beautiful green tree in God's house. That's a powerful image. He said, I trust in the steadfast love of God forever and ever. I will thank you forever because you have done it. I will wait for your name, for it is good in the presence of the godly. So even though God hasn't actually taken care of Doeg yet, God hasn't actually set him free from this yet, because he says, I will wait for your name. He's still waiting. But notice he already says, I trust in your love forever, and I will thank you forever because you've done it. As far as David's concerned, God has already dealt with this, even though he hasn't. That's faith. That is the simplest thing of faith, believing that something that hasn't happened yet is going to happen. That's hope. He has a deep hope, not a well-wishing thing. This is, I know God is going to deal with it because he is a steadfast hope. So for yourself as well, once you confide in God and trust in him to defend you, then just rest in him. Just rest. Because once you realize that you've relinquished this to God and that it's in his hands, what else can you do anyway? So many of these situations, unless we're willing to take it into our own hands and get our own vengeance, there's nothing else for us to do but to rest in peace, knowing that God will make it right. That's why Paul, in one of his letters, he says that God keeps him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on him. Because when our mind is focused on God, when we're focused on him and what he's done and how our confidence in him begins to rise, knowing that he's going to do this, and when you know that God will do it, and not just a knowing in your mind, but a deep knowing in your heart, it gives you this peace. That, yeah, God is going to do this. He's got it. And there's no need for me to be concerned of it. So we've all been wronged at some point or another in our life, to some great extent or lesser. And I'm sure that all of us will be wronged again, because we're living in a fallen world with fallen people. And we all still wrestle with a fallen nature that is continuing to be renewed in the image of our Creator. And when we run into those moments where we've been wronged and we're hurt, we're frustrated, we're angry, we're bitter, Don't go down that road. Don't meditate on those thoughts. Don't dwell on those thoughts. As quickly as you can, just confess it to God. Confide in him what's really going on. Trust in him. Meditate on his justice, his judgment, his taking care of his people, and then rest in him. Let your heart be at peace. Let your mind be at peace, and experience the rest in God while you just kick back, like David said, and I'm just going to wait for your name because it's good. And he is good. And that's why we can trust him.